I'm mad because every time I've looked in the media lately, I see another athlete with another terrible decision.
Welcome in to College Football Today. I'm Emily Proud. You just heard from the coach, Carl Reed, also special guest from the Cover 3 podcast, Bud Elliott, joining the show today. I will remind you to like this video, trying to get to 100 likes today. More would be even better than that. Also, subscribe to the channel. We would love to hear from you in the chat. I know today will be a fiery episode. A lot of people already in the chat and having some conversation, so we are monitoring that and we'll answer any and all questions that you might have for us. Carl, 100% agree with why you're mad. I'm mad that two young people lost their lives. I'm also mad that this is the biggest story of the day and we have to keep discussing it. Trust me, I think you guys agree with me here. I would much rather be talking about football. But before we get into it, let's get you caught up with what happened. This morning, a report from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution placed Georgia star defensive tackle Jalen Carter at the scene of the fatal crash involving his teammate Devin Willock and a football staff member Chandler LaCroix. The single vehicle crash occurred in the early morning following Georgia's national championship celebration. Now, the updated report stated that Carter had misled police about where he was when the crash occurred. He initially told police that he was a mile away from the accident, but is now saying that he was actually alongside the car when it crashed. The police report revealed that Carter and LaCroix were racing at the time of the accident, and LaCroix's blood alcohol concentration was more than twice the legal limit. About an hour after the story's release, police issued an arrest warrant and later charged Carter with reckless driving and street racing. Carter was at the Combine in Indy today undergoing medical testing and was scheduled to speak with reporters when this news dropped, but he is now headed back to Athens. Carter releasing a statement just a few hours ago saying, quote, "This morning I received a telephone call from the Athens, Georgia Police Department informing me that 2 misdemeanor warrants have been issued against me for reckless driving and racing. Numerous media reports also have circulated this morning containing inaccurate information concerning the tragic events of January 5th, 2023. It is my intention to return to Athens to answer the misdemeanor charges against me and to make certain that the complete and accurate truth is represented. There is no question in my mind that when all of the facts are known, that I will be fully exonerated of any criminal wrongdoing." Now, it wasn't until today, guys, that we even learned of any sort of involvement from Jalen Carter in this situation. And of course, the story is still ongoing. But as I said, he was charged with 2 misdemeanors. But what was not addressed, though, is the misleading of police and fleeing the scene. So what are the legal implications here?
It's a really interesting and tragic case, as Emily noted here, right? So misleading police may or may not be something that they could elect to look at. I don't think Jalen Carter really had any choice but to change his story, given the amount of video that the police apparently have on this, collected from city cameras and also cameras of private businesses. If you read the Atlanta Journal-Constitution report, they have a pretty detailed outline of where both Carter's truck and the truck driven by the Georgia recruiting staffer were as they weaved in and out of traffic into oncoming traffic down the center lane at speeds in excess of 100 miles an hour. So I don't really know if he had any choice but to change his story. As far as leaving the scene of the accident, I think that really comes down to what your definition of the accident and the scene is. The police initially labeled this as a single car accident. The AJC's report says that Carter's vehicle had basically scuff marks on it from the power lines that fell following the single car accident. So if you defined Carter as being involved in that accident, which obviously wouldn't make it a single car accident, you have multiple cars involved there, then maybe technically you could bring in leaving the scene of that accident. We also don't know if Carter was drinking. We know that they were all leaving the strip club there, but there are a lot of additional questions here that will have to be answered before any additional charges whether that is leaving the scene, misleading police, or even up to like a vehicular homicide type charge could be filed. We still need some more information on this.
Unfortunate situation. Obviously, lives are lost, and as the evidence keeps mounting and keeps coming out, it looks worse and worse. You're talking about racing. You're talking about alcohol being involved. You're talking about just the decisions that were made, in this situation, not being a good deal for anybody involved. Obviously, from a legal standpoint, what is Jalen Carter's responsibility to that? Bud, you being a former attorney, you're more apt to speak on that than me. But it's an unfortunate situation. It's something that hurts a lot of people. I know we'll talk a lot today about NFL stock and how it's going to affect future, but we do have to recognize that two people's lives were lost in this thing, and it's a bad deal all the way around. And it comes back to decision making because this is something that could have been avoided just by people making better choices in the moment.
And Carl, you mentioned it. Obviously, we'd love anytime Bud is able to be on the show to talk about college football, but you do have a legal background as well. So I'm curious, are there any legal implications as it pertains to the University of Georgia? You mentioned the car and the situation there.
Sure. So the car, this is sort of important for liability. It was driven by a Georgia staffer. They were out partying, and it is a Georgia leased vehicle. So from a civil standpoint, certainly that will increase the university's involvement when it comes to civil liability. I don't know if any lawsuits have been filed yet on this, but they almost certainly will be. They almost always are in tragic cases like this. I think it's important to note that I'm fairly certain here that the car that Carter was driving was not a university vehicle. I think it was a private vehicle that he was also in when he was cited for driving 89 in a 45 back in September, which is just conveniently 1 mile an hour under double the legal limit of 40, or double the speed limit of 45.
But for people like me who don't understand the difference, what difference does it make who owned the car in this situation? The car that the Georgia staffer was driving or Jalen Carter's car, how would that have a difference on the legal ramifications depending on who the owner of the vehicle was?
So from a criminal standpoint, basically none, right? From a civil standpoint, it basically brings it in more of you're claiming, hey, this is an extension of Georgia's actions as an athletic department. It's a university employee driving a university car, partying with the players. It kind of ropes them in a little bit more, establishes that legal nexus if you're looking to go after Georgia.
Gotcha. Thank you for the clarification with that. And we were chatting a little bit before the show began on the precedent and how much we've, seen this potentially impact his draft stock. And we'll get into that in just a little bit with bringing in an NFL draft analyst. We'll also head to Athens to talk to somebody there at Georgia to hear if there are any updates on that situation. But Bud, you referenced it. This is not the first time that Jalen Carter has been implicated in something involving, a vehicle. Also not the first time a Georgia player has gotten in trouble for racing this season. Is there any sort of issue there that needs to be addressed within the Georgia program?
I don't know if there is necessarily an issue, like a pervasive issue, but you have Dumas Johnson, one of their star linebackers, getting cited for racing just 5 days ago for an incident that happened 5 days prior to the crash. You have Jalen Carter doing almost double the speed limit of 45 back in September, and then you have this tragic racing incident that ended in death. And these are young guys; they feel invincible, and I'd like to hear Carl's thoughts on this, obviously. But if I'm Kirby Smart, we're done with the racing guys. Like that has got to end now. That's too dangerous to be doing down. And this is, if you pull up Google Maps, this is down like a residential street with a lot of curbs. I mean, this is not on a highway that they're doing this.
When you're coaching guys, and I'm sure when you're in Kirby Smart situation, you're talking to guys about every possible thing that can go wrong: alcohol, speeding, academics, guns, girls, any single thing in the world that can happen that can negatively impact you, that can negatively impact the program. Ultimately, those guys are going to leave the locker room, they're going to leave the meeting rooms, and decisions are going to have to be made. And so there's the responsibility of that fall on the coach? That's always the first question when a player gets in trouble. Is there a problem in the program? Is there a discipline problem? I think that Kirby Smart is probably one of the most thorough people that there is about holding his guys accountable. This is an unfortunate situation, but it's also a situation that a couple of individuals made on their own. So I think that Kirby has went over that. I'm sure he'll go over it again. They're going to have team meetings. I'm sure they've had grief counselors come in. But the overlaying thing is, as a coach, how much power do you really have over the decisions that everybody in your programs makes? The players, the coaches, etc. And that, like I said earlier, it's an unfortunate situation. But I think that everything that you would want your players to do or the way that you want them to behave, I'm sure that those things are gone over time and time again. And you hope as a coach that they make the right decisions. But you also know that there's going to be times that you get a phone call and you're going to have to deal with a situation that's unfortunate. It happens to every single coach. And you wish that there was a way to solve the problem, but there never has been.
I agree with that. And look, this shouldn't be blamed on Kirby Smart in any way. When you make the $10 million a year, you are going to be imputed some of that, right? And they're going to say, hey, like, you need to get your team to act better. I don't know if that's totally fair. I do think, though, like Carl mentioned, hey, you're going to talk about women, you're going to talk about drugs, you're going to talk about guns, you're going to talk about driving. I don't know, like, do you have a specific bullet point in your outline of your preseason talk with your team about racing? To me, that wouldn't necessarily be something that comes up. It's just, hey, I got to make sure to tell these guys, don't race each other at 100 mile an hour down the wrong way on residential streets. But like, I think if you're Kirby, that probably just needs to be extra outlined, guys. Like, this is more dangerous than you might think it is. You're not quite as in control of these cars as you think that you might be. And Carl's right. If you count the walk-ons, 100+ dudes in that locker room, you're not going to be able to control what they all do. It is a kind of a large number of racing or super speeder, as Georgia statute defines it, type incidents within the last quarter year.
When you talk about the racing, as an individual thing, I think that you do have to go over just driving safety, period, for kids. That for young people that drive, because young people are they are most likely to speed. They are most likely to take those kind of chances and do those kind of things. So it is something that you have to cover. And it's another thing. I bet you everybody in the country now is going to be talking to their team tomorrow about how you drive. I've had situations as a high school coach where I've had a parent come in because one of my players got a ticket driving 91 miles an hour. And so it's something and I don't think he was racing anybody. He was just driving extremely fast on the interstate. And that can end up in a really, really bad situation. And I know that we talked to him. I know that we made him run. I know that we did all the things that you're supposed to do to try to change his behavior. But I can tell you what, 3 days later, he got a ticket for going 89 miles an hour. So whose fault is it? Well, at that point, him being a high school kid, you take the car. But what are we really talking about?
Yeah, I mean, Carl, along those lines, this is a unique situation in that Jalen Carter is no longer a Georgia Bulldog. I mean, he's off to the NFL. He's no longer, being coached by Kirby Smart. So, we mentioned this earlier. Optically, it's usually easy to discipline the student athlete or to withhold them from play. You can't do that in this situation. I mean, how much more challenging does it make the job of Kirby Smart in handling this when Jalen Carter is no longer a member of his team? Carl?
Well, there's nothing you can do to Jalen Carter anymore. Jalen Carter is off to the NFL, and he'll deal with the NFL. The only thing that he can do is address his football team moving forward and say, these are my expectations. These are the things that are important for you to play at the University of Georgia, and you have to continue to hone in on them about what's acceptable. And it's not just racing. It's all kind of other things that can happen with a player. Kirby's been around a long time. There's all kind of trouble that you can find yourself into that as a coach you got to go over, and you hope your guys can avoid the landmines.
Totally agree with Carl on that. I think that the one thing, not the reason it should fall back on Kirby Smart, but the reason why it will in the quote unquote media is that if you're racing teammates, it's going to be sort of imputed as a team activity, right? It's, Georgia player racing Georgia player, as appears to have happened again here, right? So from that standpoint, I totally get it. This is hard to control, but and if you're Kirby, now that you've had this happen, you basically have to have, you don't want to say zero tolerance, but pretty low tolerance. I do think the lesson he can teach his team is, and we'll get to this in a little bit, if Jalen Carter's draft stock drops, Kirby can circle the amount he would have made if he had gone number 1 overall, like some of these mock drafts have had him, and how much he actually made when he went wherever he went. And he said, hey, Jalen Carter is a stud. None of y'all could block him in practice, right? Like, if it can happen to this guy and he can lose all these millions, it could happen to you. You got to be smart.
I think that you have to look deeper than the draft stock, though, because everybody does that. That's what coaches, we say, well, this guy would have got drafted. This is the amount of money that he's going to lose. Everybody on the University of Georgia, that doesn't apply to, because they're not all NFL guys that are going to play in the NFL. You have to point more towards people are dead. You could be dead. Like the guy driving the other car is dead. You could be in prison for 20 or 30 years. Even if you were not going to play in the league, if you were just going to go get a regular job making $80,000 a year, you'd rather be doing that than be dead. You'd rather be doing that than be serving 30 years in prison for vehicular homicide. Like, you have to talk a little bit deeper, because everybody that plays football doesn't want to play in the NFL, and they're not going to the NFL. And a program like Georgia probably has more guys like that are going to play than aren't. But you have to address all the guys in the room. The right guard that's a walk-on that's still on the football team, he's not thinking NFL, but you also have to teach him that he can't get drunk and drive 100 miles an hour also. So I think the NFL piece goes to like 10 or 15% of the football team, but you have to have a message that's going to resonate with every single player in the locker room. And everybody can understand that they don't want to be in prison and they don't want to be in an early grave. And those are realistic things based on the outcome that you have to talk to your football team about.
Really, really good point there, Carl. I just want to clarify, though, Willick was not the driver of the second vehicle. That was Chandler LaCroix, was a passenger, was, a part of the situation as well, but just in the sake of accuracy. We will talk about the NFL component, and first and foremost, NFL GMs are wondering where they go from here. And, as we talk about how Jalen Carter is implicated in that, we do have a clip that we want to show from a former NFL GM, Rick Spielman, on how they handle this situation.
When you hear the news that there's been an arrest warrant out for Jalen Carter for potentially being somehow involved in this, whether it was a car crash or a car chase or whatever it was, then as a general manager, you're going to have to take a step back now, and you're going to have to really do your due diligence, going through your process, going through the league security. The NFL security also has to be involved in this. Use them as a resource. Use your own team security to try to dig in and learn as much as you can, so you know what the situation is, what Jalen Carter is facing going forward. Does he have to go to trial? Will this be settled? Is he going to be potentially doing jail time? So there's so many things that have to be answered, and you have time between now and when that draft comes to get as many of those questions answered as possible. But what happens next is, once you get that information, you're going to be in that draft room, you're going to be talking to your scouts, you're going to be talking to your coaches, but most importantly, you're going to have to talk to your ownership, and you're going to have to make a decision with the news coming out today. Is it still worth us taking this player with the type of situation that he's currently in? Has nothing to do with the physical ability or what he is as a football player, but all of a sudden, now you have a decision to make as an organization.
Some great perspective there from former NFL GM Rick Spielman in Indy. Joining us now, Chris Trapasso, a CBS Sports NFL analyst. Chris, first and foremost, I'm sure that you've been working the sources today and trying to gather as much information as possible. What are you hearing as far as how this news will impact Jalen Carter's draft stock?
It's definitely going to impact it. I don't think it will impact it for every single team, and I think that clip from Rick Spielman was perfect, that there will be a lot of teams doing exactly that. And some of them will, I don't know if they'll totally remove him from their board, but this is someone that was locked into the probably top 5, maybe even top 3 of the draft, maybe the first non-quarterback off the board. And at this point, which is still very early on in the process, like Rick mentioned, there's going to be an investigation. We'll see. Jalen Carter said that he's going to exonerate himself very quickly. He's traveling back to Athens. But right now, it feels like he's probably a middle of the first round type player. If we had to put our finger on it today, that Jalen Carter, we heard some concerns about his character from Todd McShay from ESPN a few weeks ago. Was that maybe hinting at this about to come down? I thought what was weird is the timing of it. It was right before Jalen Carter was going to speak at the podium here in Indianapolis. And I hope that a team wasn't leaking that or pushing that out at such bad timing for Jalen Carter, because it's unfortunate if that was ultimately the case. But yes, this will definitely impact his stock, where teams will be a little bit more leery about a player who seemed like a surefire, home run prospect before this morning.
Yeah, the timing of all of this is very interesting. Todd McShay's comments coming out actually before the car crash occurred, so there was already, some rumblings. This obviously not helping in terms of those character concerns. From your perspective, this is not the first time that we've unfortunately had to talk about news like this ahead of the combine and talking about draft stocks dropping and this sort of thing. So what sort of historical precedents is there that can help us kind of figure out what could potentially happen here?
Well, an identical situation to this, we haven't really seen it. I mean, there's obviously the Laramie Tunsil situation that happened while he was on the clock. I think back to 2017 when here at the Combine, there was some off-the-field stuff with Reuben Foster, the Alabama linebacker, who was kind of locked in as a top half of the first-round guy and wasn't picked until the end of the first round by the San Francisco 49ers and has had a really tumultuous NFL career, really hasn't seen the field very much, dealt with some injuries, but there were some red flags with character stuff, and then he had a problem here in Indianapolis. So that's really the historical precedent that popped into my head. But certainly, again, this will impact his draft stock going from such a surefire, again, home run of a pick. The one other thing that I've heard from sources is it's easy for us to talk about and say, hey, if he can exonerate himself, then everything should be fine. He's, like Rick said, he's such a good player. We all know that. It's very obvious on film. But when you are an actual GM and you are about to pick someone as the number 3 or the number 4 player in the draft, you're kind of putting your job on the line to a certain degree. If you're Jonathan Gannon, the new head coach of the Arizona Cardinals, that a team that certainly needs defensive line help, you're now going to question everything with Jalen Carter and maybe lean away from him when you were really leaning heavily toward him. Even Shane Steichen with the Indianapolis Colts, a lot of the teams inside the top 10 weren't very good last year and have new head coaches and new general managers. It's different when you're actually making the selections in the NFL draft as a GM, ultimately calling in that selection. It's going to really lead to a lot of hesitation now because of all these off-the-field concerns and this very serious and tragic event that apparently Jalen Carter was a part of and initially did not tell the truth to the police in terms of his involvement in it.
The comp I would make here, interestingly, is La'el Collins in 2015. So La'el Collins out of LSU was a projected first-round guard, and he was not considered a suspect in this murder that had happened in Louisiana, but he was being asked to come in and talk to the police in that state after the draft date. And because he had a prior relationship with a pregnant woman who was murdered, teams were very hesitant about that. And he actually ended up going undrafted, I believe. And he's had a great career starting with the Cowboys. But to me, the open-ended nature of what's going on with Carter is the reason I would comp that, right? Right now, he's charged with 2 misdemeanors. I don't expect that he would get hit with vehicular homicide here. But under the Georgia statute, if they decided that he was causing the death of another person via the speeding, the underlying, felony potentially, if they wanted to upgrade the reckless, then that could be hangover. So I think for Jalen Carter and for NFL teams, clearing up the matter as to whether he will be charged with anything additionally is the most important thing here as far as how far his stock will fall in the draft. If it's just these 2 misdemeanors, yes, you just had the Henry Ruggs situation, which was also tragic and just, driving really, really recklessly. But if they get some closure that he will not be charged with additional things, I would still expect him to go in the first round, just after Will Anderson and after Tyree Wilson at a minimum.
When you're looking at NFL draft picks, one of the first things that the NFL is going to look at is what is your availability? Your best ability is your availability. So, from a legal standpoint, is he exonerated? Like you said, Bud, he was charged with only 2 misdemeanors. He doesn't have a felony charge. So, do you feel like he's going to be available to play football games for you if you draft him? Number one. And a point was brought up earlier that was another good one. When you're the GM, and you have to make that pick, do you go with the character issue because you feel like your job is in the line? But you have to also look on the other side of the aisle. The other side of the aisle is if you need a defensive line help and Jalen Carter is there and you don't pick him, then guess what? You can get fired for losing and not being good enough on the defensive line. But we have to come to reality within sports is this. There's only a handful of guys that are good enough to play on the defensive line in the National Football League. So after the NFL teams go through their thorough investigations, and nobody in any pro sports league is as thorough as the National Football League and the agencies that they put out and the legal people that they use to get information. And when we say character issues, that is a very broad term. Are we talking about stuff that's not palatable to us? What do the guys in the locker room say about Jalen Carter? A lot of guys in the Georgia locker room say he's a great teammate. I know several coaches who coach on the staff at the University of Georgia that say he's never been a problem and they haven't had any issues with him. And so, in terms of some of the off the field stuff, being a character issue, those are things that we may look at as an issue, but that GMs and football coaches don't see as an issue. I think that as long as he's available to play, he's still going to go in the first round. If he slides to mid or bottom of the first round, it actually might be better for him because he's going to go to a better football team that may have more of a veteran locker room presence than some of the really bad teams that pick at the beginning of the draft. So those are things that are very important in this case. When we say a guy has character issues, we have to clearly define exactly what we mean and exactly what we're saying from a character standpoint. And two, those general managers and those head football coaches, we have to live in the reality that they're paid to win. When you lose, you get fired quicker than anything. People will get over bad behavior. They will not get over you losing. So if Jalen Carter is there and you need a defensive lineman, I don't expect them to get picked in the top 5, but I do expect for somebody to say he's a steal. If he's exonerated, we've got to take the chance right here, right now.
And along those lines, Chris, you mentioned just how important, obviously, the decision is for these general managers, how the research and the investigations that they're all doing on their own. This is not something that they're going to sit around and wait for the Athens Police Department to come out with it. They're doing their own investigations internally to figure out as much as they possibly can. You heard some of his Georgia teammates come out after the Todd McShay report was released, coming to his defense, talking about, character concerns. I don't know what you're talking about. Jalen Carter is a great teammate. And so you have all of this kind of going on all at once. Is there something, or what is something that Jalen Carter himself can do to make some of these NFL teams feel a little bit more comfortable about where they choose to select him?
Well, I think first and foremost, just obviously being able to exonerate himself. And I really think that we could have two things at play here, where two separate incidents where obviously everything that happened with this vehicular homicide or this tragic incident, and then maybe the character stuff was what we see a lot of the times in the NFL draft process, where there is a team that tries to leak something to ultimately get a really, really good player that they have no chance of getting otherwise to fall in the draft. So I think it was really good for Jalen Carter today to have guys like Nolan Smith come out and say, hey, look, this guy was one of the best teammates that I've had when I've been at Georgia. That to be able to clear that up, I think is one thing. Completely different situation with the legal side of it. And he could ultimately, come out of this, I don't want to say clean, but a lot better than he did today. It was kind of something that sent shockwaves through the NFL combine media here because it happened again. The timing was so strange, But to me, the character issues like Carl was mentioning, I'm a little bit skeptical of those. And again, those feel more so like something that we see every couple years get leaked about a top tier player. But then separately, the legal thing, getting that settled, I think we could ultimately look back on this in a couple months and still see Jalen Carter as a top 10 pick. Maybe his draft stock impacted negatively a little bit, but the team that I've circled, the Pittsburgh Steelers at number 17 overall, with Mike Tomlin, such a veteran-laden locker room. Mike Tomlin, one of the best, most liked player coaches in the NFL, kind of with that style that really lends itself to having strong relationships with his players. That's as far as I can see Jalen Carter falling, unless, there are some big-time legal ramifications in front of him.
I don't necessarily have the same skepticism of Todd McShay's report, right? Todd McShay for ESPN has covered the draft for a long time. He didn't say this on some show like First Take where they're just throwing out hot take read just for ratings, right? I mean, this is a guy who's covered the draft for a long time. They have producers and editors there who are going to want to know behind the scenes of what Todd was told before he reported it. I think obviously like the recent actions and the lying to the police make his report more believable. And I definitely don't find teammates sticking up for the guy dispositive as to him having character concerns for McShay. Like, find me an example of teammates saying, yeah, that guy's a jerk. He's a criminal. You won't. Like, even if it's the truth, teammates do not throw other teammates under the bus publicly. So, like, I put zero value in what his teammates say publicly about him. They're all going to stick up for the guy.
Well, I mean, I understand that, but I don't know if everybody would stick up for him in a situation like this. But he's had an awful lot of guys inside that locker room that off the record just don't agree that he has these character issues. But one thing that I do say is this: we have to define character issues may mean something completely different to all four of us here. If we talk something that would upset you, may not upset me. Something that bothers me may not bother Emily, vice versa. You can go around. So when I hear the word character issues, I'm always leery about that when I hear that about a player. I want to know exactly what happened. And if I don't know exactly what happened, I can't buy into it. I can look right now and say, well, you raced, and in this race, there was an accident in the other car, and we lost life. I can quantify that. But the other things that you're saying, I mean, I talk to a lot of guys on that staff all the time. They just don't have that experience with him in terms of him being a bad person.
That's fair. I mean, look, you're gonna get what you get from the guys on Georgia's staff, and I put more stock into what dudes Carl's known a long time telling him than I do teammates who have known Jalen Carter for 2 years, putting out on Twitter.
Yeah, and the tough part too is there are 11 other Georgia players that are at the combine that will probably get asked about this as well, and so they do have to answer some of those tough questions. Carl, I will say, I'm using character concerns as just that, like one of those buzzy phrases that we use, like interviews well and top end speed, all the fun things that we say around that time. But you're 100% correct in that those do need to be specific, because one thing could mean something completely different. Chris, thank you so much for your perspective. We appreciate you joining the show. This was very helpful, and have a good one.
Thanks, guys.
All right, there is, of course, the Georgia part of all of this. Kirby Smart releasing a statement saying, quote, "The charges announced today are deeply concerning, especially as we are still struggling to cope with the devastating loss of two beloved members of our community. We will continue to cooperate fully with the authorities while supporting these families and assessing what we can learn from this horrible tragedy." Let's welcome in somebody on the ground in Athens, Jordan Hill of Dogs 24/7. Jordan, appreciate you joining the show today. Definitely a very important person to get perspective from. First and foremost, as we know, Jalen Carter is headed back to Athens. Is there anything new to report out of Athens at this hour?
Not at this point. Before we came on, I popped on just to check the jail log, make sure he had not been booked. To this point, he has not. Just going to keep an eye on that for the next day or so to see if that occurs. But like you mentioned, Emily, he had put out a statement saying that it was his intent to go back to Athens to basically take care of these charges. In that statement, he made it clear that he felt like the truth would come out. He felt like there were inaccuracies reported, said sort of a blanket statement about what he felt was unfair to him. But we'll follow this. It's just sort of a wait and see as far as when Jalen gets back to Athens and when he is booked on those 2 misdemeanor charges.
You've been very busy today, just releasing a column not too long ago about all of this. And something that you mentioned is that people could wind up losing their jobs by the time this is all said and done. So what's the fallout? What effect does all of this have on the Georgia program internally right now?
Well, it's something that we're going to watch. And, there's nothing that I've seen that makes me think someone specifically will lose their job. But they know without a doubt that there has to be things put in place. I mean, that there was protocol that was broken. We had a chance to talk to Athletic Director Josh Brooks a few weeks ago, and the accident was one of the discussion points, and he talked about that things were not followed properly. Specifically, the car that Chandler LaCroix, the recruiting staffer who was killed, it should have been turned back in. The vehicle should not have been on the road at 2:30, 2:45 in the morning. Protocol was not followed. She was obviously still in that vehicle. And as we learned today, she was drunk and she was over twice the legal limit. So it's a situation where, at the very least, protocol has to change. And that the way things internally have worked, that someone has to look and say these things have to be, there have to be checks and balances to avoid a situation like this, because more bigger than anything, and I made sure to make this point in the column, 2 young lives were lost because of this accident, a 24-year-old and a 20-year-old. It was a situation that should have been avoided, and you hope coming out of this that people will be smart about putting in the proper checks and to put people in place to make sure something like this never happens again.
I mean, anytime you have something like this, whether or not making a change of personnel is going to curb or alter future behavior, you're going to have a fall guy. So I totally agree with Jordan. Like, somebody's going to lose their job over this, and maybe should. Jordan, I had a follow-up for you, if I could. Carter, in his statement, had talked about exonerating himself and clearing up a lot of these media inaccuracies. Given the nature of the reporting, which appears to be mostly based on video, what do you think he's getting at here? Like, is he trying to claim he wasn't driving, or what? Like, what have you heard anything on the ground there that would make you think he's going to be exonerated from these?
Yeah, that part of it, and some of us around the program had kind of talked about it today, not really understanding what exactly he's talking about. And to me, it's a statement that it kind of feels like just sort of an open-ended, the truth will come out. And I can't say specifically what he's getting at. He didn't really say specifically with his statement, oh, well, this was false or that was false. I think it's something that is just going to play out, and that's part of it. That I think people are beginning to understand. And I think people knew when this accident happened, before Jalen Carter's name ever was linked to this wreck on January 15th, that this wasn't going to go away anytime soon. And the developments today make that all the more clear, that this is going to be something we're going to be talking about for quite a while to come. And, I don't know how long this is going to go out, how long this is going to play out. But it's definitely something that, especially with the news today, we know that there's going to be further reporting done and continuing to follow this story as more things develop.
What's next in this process? We've heard, his statement saying that he is going back and is going to try to fight this. What sort of news should we be expecting to come down next?
Well, I think the biggest thing is just going to be for him to essentially turn himself in, that he'll be booked, and I would imagine he'll be released not long after that. And then from that point, I think we're all just kind of waiting to see what does happen. I know just from dealing with Georgia and dealing with the university, I don't expect them to say very much. They're going to do their part to just sort of step back, and it's what they did during the actual investigation when the accident first happened. There wasn't a whole lot of talk. There was a statement that day, I believe, from Kirby Smart, also just from the UGA athletics as a whole, just a statement they put out. I don't intend I don't anticipate, I should say, that we'll see Kirby Smart saying very much other than the statement that he put out today. And then the next time we're going to talk to him is going to be at Pro Day, which I believe is going to be March 15th. And, you'll probably get questions in then, but I'd have to imagine that Kirby's going to be very tight-lipped about it. He may even read a statement beforehand and say, I'm not taking any more questions after this. It's hard to say, but again, we're going to be following it, but it's a situation where, one, I don't expect a whole lot to come from Georgia on this other than what came out today. And two, we're just going to kind of follow the legal system and see what comes next, specifically when it comes to Jalen Carter and when he arrives back in Athens.
And you mentioned the processes that could potentially change internally, externally, and optically. Obviously, there's we're talking about it on this show. They're talking about it on all the draft shows. It's a big deal in terms of what it means for the Georgia program. So in your opinion, as this is still kind of breaking and developing, what sort of impact and what sort of effect has this news story in particular had or will have on the Georgia program as a whole?
Well, it's going to be interesting because you think about, if any of you watched today Nolan Smith talk about Devin, he was very emotional, and you understand why. I mean, this was a teammate again. I like stressing to people about this situation. Take football aside. This was a 20-year-old kid who died in this accident along with a 24-year-old in Chandler LaCroix. To me, more than anything, I'm very interested in just seeing what we hear from current players, because they're all dealing with this too. And some of these people, we've learned a little bit more, and I'm sure more details will come out about who was there when the accident happened, who was, on the scene. Those details have kind of trickled out. What's going to happen from that standpoint? And then two, Kirby Smart, you look at where Georgia is right now, having won back-to-back national championships. How does he handle this? I mean, even more on just the emotional side of losing a player. I mean, to my knowledge, I don't think Georgia has had a player die while he was the head coach, and I'm not sure about his time at Alabama before that. But it's a lot, and it's a situation too that, again, you kind of have to balance when you look at this, the emotional side of it of losing a player, and also understand that there are legal ramifications coming out of this. So it's something that is not going to go away. I'm sure we're going to talk about it going into spring practice. I'll be interested just to see what access looks like, especially dealing with some of the players and some of the coaches that we'll get to talk to. But again, sort of like I said a few minutes ago, this is just not going to be something that goes away. And the more details and any more developments that come out of what we learned on Wednesday, that's only going to add to it and be something that will break down further going forward.
When you take and set aside the legal issues, you have to also discuss everybody's mental health involved. You got the coaching staff who lost a player and a recruiting staffer. You have the guys in the locker room. And we tend to, in the game of football, try to just get back to business as usual. But sometimes you got to talk to somebody. If you've ever been around a group of football players who's lost a teammate tragically, this is something that can take a large toll, on the group as a whole. It can take a lot on coaches. When you're coaching and you're recruiting a guy and you're going and talking to his family, you're not wanting to have to call that parent and say your child is dead. It's a lot of things that go into that. I hope that everybody's mental health is okay and that they all get the help and support that they need from that perspective of the issue.
For sure.
So,
and
Jordan,
I think that, yeah, go ahead. Go ahead, bud.
No, go ahead, Jordan.
I was just going to say, we've heard bits and pieces. Again, there's not been a ton of availability since the season, but Warren McClendon talked about that at the Senior Bowl, said that, he had talked to people kind of helping him through because he was in that car. He was one of the two people who survived the car where Devin Willock and Chandler LaCroix were killed. And even, again, the people that weren't there that night, I mean, the teammates, the other offensive linemen, the people that just knew Devin, even, some of the Georgia men's basketball players. I think about Jabri Abdur-Rahim. He's from New Jersey, and they struck up a friendship because that's where Devin Willock was from. So there was a lot of people who were affected by this who knew Devin and who knew Chandler as well. And again, I mean, like Carl said, I mean, it's all about making sure everybody's taken care of because it's a very traumatic situation. And it's something that I hope everybody kind of understands how important that is going forward.
Jordan had mentioned that to his knowledge, Kirby Smart had not been on a team that had a player tragically die. I want to make sure I have the timeline right on this, but Kirby Smart was the DC at Valdosta State in 2001 and then became a graduate assistant at Florida State in 2002. So that spring, Devon Darling, actually, one of their star receivers, collapsed and died during workouts. Like I would expect Kirby Smart to give, Mickey Andrews, the former defensive coordinator there, a call, and guys that he's still close with from that early 2000 Florida State staff, and say, how did you guys handle this after that, right? Like what obviously you bring in grief counselors, you bring in mental health experts. From a football standpoint, how do you handle this, right? And I don't know. This is tough, man.
Jordan,
Absolutely.
Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead. I was just going to say it's very tough, and it's one of those situations where, especially even us as writers, I'd only talked to Devin once or twice, but it kind of puts things in perspective, and you think about the relationships that everybody in the program had with both Devin and Chandler, and you make sure to kind of keep that in mind, especially when you're reporting out, what happened on January 15th and everything that's happened since.
What's the mood amongst the fan base right now? You're on Dogs 24/7. I'm sure you see the message boards and all the conversations that are happening there on Twitter. I mean, everywhere. Well, can you kind of encapsulate what the mood is right now as this news broke today?
Well, I think it was a bit of surprise. I mean, I don't think that there was a ton of connection to Jalen Carter and this accident. I do think there have been reports in the weeks after the accident that, Jalen maybe had been headed to a Waffle House, which is where it was reported that the group was headed when the accident happened, and that maybe Jalen had come back to be on the scene. It wasn't really clear. I do think that there were people that were frustrated, and I really do understand this part of it, of the timing. I mean, that Jalen, when this broke, was probably 15, 20 minutes away from talking to media in Indianapolis. And I think that there was some questions of why was the timing what it was. And, I can't speak to that. And I try to look, on the side of understanding that a investigation in an accident like this is going to take a while. That the timing really had nothing to do with Jalen being at the combine, and that it was just a situation that played out the way it did. And there are people who obviously in this fan base who understand the kind of player Jalen is, and hopes that he gets to prove that at the next level. We'll see how things play out. It's one of those situations that it's so hard to kind of balance talking about Jalen, who's a very good football player, but also understanding it's a very serious situation and one we want to see play out before we kind of dive into it any further.
Jordan, thank you so much for coming on the show today, providing your perspective. Everyone be sure to check out Dogs 24/7 for all things Georgia, especially right now with so much happening, so many question marks that we still need to answer. Also, check out the column that Jordan has right now. It's called, quote, "Don't Lose Sight During a Dark Day" for Georgia football. Go check that out. Really, really great work there. Guys, we're going to close the show as we always do, and that is with one final college football today takeaway. I know that it was a heavy show today, an important one, though. This is something that a lot of shows are going to be talking about. A lot of people are wanting to get more answers. So I do appreciate you guys trying to answer some of those questions. But let's finish with a takeaway. Carl, what do you got?
My takeaway would just be that without everything that's happened in sports lately, with this incident with Jalen, with the incident with the guys on the Alabama basketball team, with what I saw today with Ja Morant, decision making has to be a premium. You have to make sure that you're making decisions that are going to add value to you and not put you in a position where it completely takes your life off the rails. When you go to these college campuses, when you get to these professional teams, you have to understand that you are different. You're not normal. You're different from everybody else because you're going to be on a bigger stage. You have some things and some amenities that other people don't have, but you have got to be able to make decisions. And always remember that the consequences last longer than the party.
Well said, Bud.
I think my takeaway is really one that Carl had earlier in the show, right? About guys who aren't going to the pros. There are certain things you can get arrested for. They really won't impact your ability to get a job later on in life, right? You get a little weed charge. For the most part, you can get whatever job you want, right? Any kind of misdemeanors. A lot of jobs require you to drive. Like there are a lot of good sales jobs. You're going to have to be driving a company car, right? I have to drive for CBS. If you get a really idiotic, reckless driving charge, HR and risk management will look at that. They're going to say, this guy's driving 100 in a 40. Can't employ him to do this job. It shuts a lot of doors for you. So just be smart about just trying to avoid the big mistakes and realizing that some mistakes may be bigger than you know.
100%. My final takeaway is I just want to say I really feel for the families, the LaCroix and the Willock families, not just, the tragedy that they had to live through, but with this news coming out today, I mean, they're going to continue to have to face this and relive it on all of these shows, on talking about, leading up to the draft, the months to come and all of that. This is something that's not going to go away. And although, I said at the beginning of the show, this is not something that we relish doing at all and having to talk about this. We'd much rather be talking about football and breaking down the X's and O's. But for us, it's a tough story to tell. For them, it's an incredibly harsh reality and, frankly, a nightmare. And so I just want to send my thoughts and prayers to those families. It's going to be a tough road ahead for them. But thank you guys so much for the thoughtful conversations today, the great analysis. Do appreciate it. Enjoy your weekend. We'll see you back here next Monday at 5 o'clock. Have a good one.